is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording live today from the Australia Pavilion at COP30 in Belém, Brazil. And I'm joined, as always, by my two co-hosts, and not as always, by one special guest. First up, we've got Global Vice President for Marketing Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie, and good to see you representing the podcast merch stall in a stylish sage green Let Me Sum Up t-shirt.
Well, having tried to extort the collective Australian public for the last couple of years on t-shirts, it would be a massive KPI failure not to wear some of our own. Happily repping the more sufficiency now request, but very good to be here. And just like so many have been doing at the Australia Pavilion while we would be here, I would really like to acknowledge that we are meeting on lands of Indigenous people of the Amazon here and pay our respects to them for hosting us.
We're also joined by a man who clearly didn't get the memo about wearing the themed LMSU t-shirt. Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Outrageous.
Lies. Filthy lies.
Okay, so for those of you playing along in the audio version of this podcast,
Tennant angry.
Tennant just ripped open his shirt to reveal a bright yellow, more sufficiency now t-shirt. I guess you're like sufficiency man now?
Well, I view it as an ironic t-shirt, Luke.
Oh, okay, you're ironically sufficient.
Yeah.
I'm more than ironic enough.
And a woman, no doubt, wondering what she's stumbled into, long-standing COP maven and current senior associate for climate diplomacy at the climate think tank ECHO, Alex Scott. G'day, Alex.
Hello, great to be here. Thanks very much.
It's great to have you here. On this week's show, we talk about, I'm not really sure what. What we were going to talk about was, the success factors for a successful COP31, but we find ourselves at an interesting moment. Can one of us describe what we found in our feeds when we woke up, here in Belém, in terms of the reports that have been coming through in the Australian media?
It's fair to say there's been a little bit of cognitive dissonance between what we've been hearing and seeing on the ground and then some of the reporting back at home, which has been pretty negative about the potential outlook on Australia hosting COP next year. And that earlier in the week stood in pretty stark contrast to what we heard Minister Bowen say here at the ministerial reception, that we're in it to win it and we're in it till the end. I think that's very much the sentiment that he's carried through. But obviously negotiations have accelerated over the last couple of days, and this morning there are reports that it's likely that the COP won't be hosted in Adelaide. But equally, there's no official confirmation of any of that, and we know that these negotiations are happening as we speak.
So unsourced reports, the innuendo and scuttlebutt is flying thick and fast. I've got my phone here, my laptop here, WhatsApp groups and Signal groups are pumping. But the reality is it's very unclear what's going on, right, Tennant?
So I would compare the tone of the messages first thing this morning to the scene in the Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, where Denethor looks out on the armies of Sauron, goes mad and runs screaming, "Flee, flee for your lives." Things have hauled back a little bit since then. But something close to a complete morale collapse spiral briefly unfolded. Now, actually, we think we don't know what's happening.
Yep.
And we're here to share that lack of knowledge with you.
Alex, we were having a chat while we went to get coffee earlier, and what we can do, perhaps productively, is think about, the darker timeline where we don't have a COP. And there are still some opportunities for Australia to play a very productive role in that light. Do you want to talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my WhatsApp groups, the number of groups that have got this Groundhog Day gif going through it, because we've had these rumours every single day here at COP, which way COP31 hosting might go. But I think, it's worth us thinking about the role that Australia is playing now that it has a very progressive climate policy. It's putting the effort into developing the proper sectoral plans and showing a bit of leadership that other countries can learn from. Australia is now back at the table in the international climate negotiations, whether that is as the president of the next COP or whether that's as a member of the umbrella group and a potentially very influential middle power player who has these strong relationships with the Pacific and has made these overtures on the role that Australia wants to play in defending Pacific interests, in pushing for ambitious climate action globally. There are plenty of things that Australia can do as a non-president. In fact, there's probably more even that Australia can do as a non-president to push for ambitious outcomes at COP31.
Alex, you're saying this is better.
I'm saying we make the most of any situation, guys, and we want to make sure that Australia can play its part and definitely keen to help it do so.
It's not a binary, right, in terms of the influence that Australia can have. It's not that we're completely off the field. There are things that are possible. And one thing that's been very clear in all the reporting is that regardless of the outcome, the Pacific will have a very critical role, whether the COP is hosted in Antara or Adelaide. And so it's interesting to think through, like, how Australia can productively support the Pacific in, hosting a leadership forum, whatever the scenario is, to make that a much more impactful event than perhaps we've seen leaders forums be in the past.
And we've seen really clear messages coming from Pacific leaders at this COP and in the lead up to COP here on the kinds of things they want to see from the international system. Some really clear direction towards how the world is going to phase out from fossil fuels and how we're going to shift to 100% renewable energy systems, including this huge push that we've had from Pacific leaders for 100% renewable Pacific, which is amazing to see. And there are so many things that Australia can do to support those drives. Here at COP, we are actually having serious conversations about agreeing on setting a roadmap for that transition away from fossil fuels, something that I don't think any of us really thought was possible before we got here in Belém and heard President Lula really put that on the table and wedge that Overton window way open. Australia hasn't yet been one of the really vocal voices in support of agreeing something that would end up with a process for countries to talk about how do you actually do that transition away from fossil fuels, how do you decommission, how do you transform your energy systems, your grids, your infrastructure so that the renewables that you bring in are going to displace the fossil fuels, things like that, things that we can really use this sort of global process to share knowledge, to bring in the experts, to find the ways to matchmake between the investors and the project proponents and the policymakers. Australia could really support this process delivering something like that, could shepherd it potentially as a presidency in partnership with the Pacific, if that is the way it ends up, or could help drive it as a really strong middle power actor in the process anyway.
And one of the things that I noted in Minister Bowen's remarks to the UNFCCC when he made them on Tuesday was this reference to, entering the decade of electrification, which is a part, that's how you operationalise the fossil fuel phase out, is that fuel switching, where there's already technology in place, and also supporting the developed world to leapfrog fossil fuel technology to maximise the amount of end use that is delivered by electricity. There is a huge role for Australia to play in telling that story. It's kind of the flip side to the renewable rollout, and so I guess we'll see. I think more updates to come, potentially over the course of this podcast recording, but Tennant, you had...
Well, just an extra thought here, which is fundamentally the worst possible outcome on the bid. The worst possible outcome on the bid would be a failed process that delivers no agreed outcome and a COP31 that defaults to a country that doesn't want it with a bad odour of dissension.
Sure.
And that's bad. And we don't want that.
Yep.
Now, from one point of view, that makes us weak and lacking the killer instinct to prevail.
Yep.
But there's forms of victory that are just not worthwhile.
Yep. A scorched earth situation is in no one's interest, particularly when the multilateral system is kind of a fragile moment.
And I was going to say, I think what's been really striking actually about the Brazilian presidency's I guess, approach to these negotiations is very much with that in mind. Like, we saw some pretty extraordinary moves from them in the last couple of days, and I think very much with a view to putting their mark on the process and making it be an affirmation of multilateralism. And I think, can we talk about that a little bit? A couple of us have been following what's known as the Muchirao, which is, I think it's a community, like a gathering to solve problems, and that's sort of been a place where some of these so-called Big Four issues have been discussed, but it's morphed into very much what would be the political package and kind of cover text out of this COP. And yesterday, Tulio, the lead negotiator for Brazil, who's been hosting those negotiations, came in, and those of us who were watching were expecting to hear a lot of interventions and comments on the latest, on the iteration of the text, which contained very few brackets. It was a already very streamlined text and a few options on those most contentious issues that we'd been hearing about all week. But instead of kind of having a 2-hour back and forth of interventions around what everyone thought about it, he was like, here's the proposed approach. We're going to meet with ministerial pairs at 5 p.m. We'd like you to all work amongst yourselves and bring us streamlined options for that text by 7 p.m. We're going to have a report in from the technical negotiations at 7 p.m. Please stay till midnight, and we'll hope to issue a final package for adoption, like to close the COP tomorrow. Which is nuts.
As in today?
As in today.
Okay.
Like 3 days early.
So by the time you're listening to this, it may be done, but also maybe not.
But I think the point to really focus on was what he said following that, and to which there were no objections, right? All parties didn't make any interventions, and then they got on with it following that. He said it would be an incredibly powerful signal to the world and an affirmation of the process, especially in the context we find ourselves in now, that we can come together, the process is working, it's possible to have these conversations in a respectful way and land on meaningful outcomes.
And especially the specific conversations that would have been had in that scenario about some of the most contentious topics facing this forum, right?
Well, I mean, it was a big job, right? Like, it started, and I think you have to admire the strategy in what they've done, really, by avoiding, a bit of a shit fight at the start of the 2 weeks on the agenda and just hiving that off into a separate discussion, probably knowing that it would evolve into, well, that'll be the thing where we discuss the kind of overall political package. But it hasn't landed yet. And, as of 10 a.m, while there's no resolution on our bid to host COP31, there's also no new text from yesterday to have a look at, as far as I've been able to tell. Yep.
Kennedy's scanning his phone, but we went deep on what the Big Four are on the most recent episode of the pod, but do we want to just quickly give the TLDR on the Big Four for those that haven't caught up with that episode yet or aren't following the negotiations closely?
Well, again, we can all adopt a favourite one. There's Article 9.1, there's BTR, there's NDCs, and there's UTMs. Alex, do you have a favourite?
I mean, the presidency has specifically put them all together in a package because you can't really talk about one of them without the others. But I think the thing that's worrying me most is how we respond to the gap in ambition in the NDCs. The NDCs being the national climate plans that countries put together, and about 120 of them have put them forward so far this year. There are still a few more countries that still need to put their plans on the table, but overall, the plans so far reduce emissions by about 12% by 2035, but to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce emissions by 60% by 2035. So that's quite a wide gap in the level of ambition between what countries are prepared to say they're doing and what we really need to see. And that's what this process is for, to kind of agree how we can collectively together address that gap and help each other reduce emissions faster. And that's what's being discussed in one of those big four.
Tenant, just say what they are. We don't need to go around the horn again.
Okay, well, just to say, the unilateral trade measures is UTM. That's highly contested language. Climate measures with cross-border implications is another way of looking at these issues. The wonderful contribution that trade can make to combating climate change is another way again. And there's a real breadth in those options for dealing with this issue that is in the text that we saw early yesterday. And two of those options look clearly unacceptable to different groups of parties. One of those options looks like a big talk fest that would do nothing. And the third option...
Sounds very UNFCCC.
Oh, but the third option might be just right, although that's not actually literally number 3. That's option number 2.
I mean, I want to circle back to, the comments around NDCs and where to next on ambition, because that is one of the thematics and issues that will very much carry on to next year if Australia were to host a COP or be a president at COP. And, I mean, I was interested, Alex, if you had any thoughts on the couple of options that have been floated there in the last version of the Muchirao text. One of them suggested that, and this was sort of floated by the AOSIS grouping from pretty early on in the piece, that they want to see some kind of a roadmap where there's parties look to kind of analyse the gap from where we are to what's needed for 1.5 and have parties, basically put forward plans for how they would bridge that gap. And I think there was even a suggestion that the name for it could be a Belém roadmap to 1.5 or something like that. Do you think there's likely to be convergence around an initiative like that?
It's definitely going to depend on what there is convergence around in compromises across what we do on trade and how countries can address the different trade measures that they feel either kind of disadvantaged by, and on what kind of finance outcome can be delivered here at COP. The question on finance that's been put to these consultations under the Big Four is the question of how much finance developed countries provide to developing countries, not the finance that gets mobilized from the private sector using that as leverage, but what is actually provided by developing countries. And the question that is being put forward is, where did that go in the climate finance goal that was agreed last year? We kind of had this outcome for a $300 billion a year total climate finance goal that's provided and mobilized. So it's a really legitimate question that's being raised. The proposals to deal with that are also things like dialogues and roadmaps. So we've got kind of roadmaps and dialogues across all of these 4 contentious issues being put forward. So I think there's potential to agree something that kind of addresses all of them together. There's definitely still, it's on the table that something like a roadmap to 1.5 could be agreed as a way to use this UNFCCC process to keep talking about how countries can better work together to help each other reduce their emissions faster, how they can learn from each other's policies, and so on. But there's also a lot of skepticism because we have tried these things in this UNFCCC process before. We've had a mitigation work program that has had some really useful technical discussions when you've got the policymakers who are writing the emission reduction policies in the room rather than the negotiators. Love them as we do. Their skill sets are perhaps not quite as attuned to the deep industrial planning that is most useful to have countries exchanging on. We've also had this idea of a UAE dialogue to discuss the global stocktake decision that was taken in Dubai a couple of years ago, where there was this commitment initially to transition away from fossil fuels and triple renewables. And we haven't even started that dialogue yet because we can't yet agree on what the scope is or what the modalities of that would be. So there's a lot of skepticism about setting these roadmap processes. But at the same time, the UNFCCC has kind of completed developing the Paris Agreement and its rule book. So we are at a turning point for this whole process. We're at the moment where we need to work out how to use this annual gathering of countries and non-state actors in a useful way that's going to actually progress our climate action. And these roadmaps and dialogues could be that new way forward for the UNFCCC process, but we really need to get it right and work out how to do it together.
And part of that, to your point, Alex, part of that is very much about having the right people in the room, which is not just limited to parties, but there are international organisations, there are national stakeholders, business organisations, civil society who have actually useful things to contribute and useful context for those. For instance, in the trade space, trade is a complex thing, and it intersects here with industry policy and with national climate policy design in a way that is definitely not necessarily the skill set of the people who have been shouting at each other for the last 5 years about unilateral climate-related trade measures or whatever. And so moving to a room which is less shouty and more nerdy would be great. Even though nerds have been known to disagree with one another from time to time.
Yeah.
You reckon?
No.
I mean, I think it's an interesting challenge, right? Because we've observed this kind of, the kind of weight and gravity of the growing kind of action agenda around COPs, which is really around the implementation of all the things the negotiators have been kind of setting up the process for, is getting bigger. And the negotiating agenda, as you've said, Alex, is getting smaller. So how we kind of find a balance to make spaces for those conversations is really important. And this feels like a bit of a threshold COP on some of that, particularly on the finance side of things, right? So just to take the... we've talked a little bit about 9-1 here, but it goes to this, like, on the one hand, dynamic from developing countries and very much led by the Arab group and LMDC grouping, which are like, well, it's all very well for you to want to ask us to do all these things and, conditional NDCs, but we can't deliver that until you deliver the finance that you've promised, and they contend you are not delivering in line with expectation. So we need to see that before we ramp up on this. And it was interesting sitting in the high-level event on the Baku to Belém roadmap, right, which is really an attempt, I think, by the Azerbaijani presidency to acknowledge on the way through with the new quantified goal on the NCQG on the 300 billion, that actually a much larger flow of finance is necessary that involves non-party actors. So it's how are you crowding in private capital? How are you going to provide, a space and a role for those actors to play a more active role into the future?
Yeah, and really interesting to see in that Baku to Belém roadmap that they published here, or just ahead of COP, that they're targeting the kinds of actions that need to be taken in completely separate multilateral cooperative regimes around finance, what the multilateral development banks need to do, what the IMF needs to do, what we need countries to do, and how they're kind of calculating their finance. And we haven't seen a hugely positive reception to that report here in Belém. That's perhaps a learning on how not to do roadmaps, to be honest, because that was a very presidency-only led process. The two presidencies, Azerbaijan and the incoming Brazilian presidency, took on the role of drafting. They did have a circle of finance ministers that was kind of loosely representative of different countries who also consulted on what kinds of actions need to be taken across the whole finance system. They produced their own report. The presidencies produced a separate report, but they didn't quite get it out until a couple of days before the COP. So countries here didn't have a lot of time to really process what was in there, process what their reactions to it would be, and how to take that kind of thing forward.
I don't know if you were at the event itself, but it was kind of a strange format in a way, because you had You had the COP30 and COP29 presidents, and you had the COP30 CEO and attorney, and then lead negotiators for those two presidencies. And then in kind of making some framing remarks about the work, you then sort of saw interventions from the floor from parties and groupings saying, like broadly, that they welcomed it, but also kind of commenting that because it happened outside of the COP process, like it doesn't have any official standing or status, and because a lot of the, the actions kind of identified in there kind of sit outside the influence of parties themselves, then there was a well, what do we do with this next kind of thrust of comments. And it was also one of the forums where, the absence of who could be picking that up in a future presidency was also very noticeable as well.
So just as a flavour for people in the room with us physically right now know that this is a very dynamic process. And for people who are listening subsequently, a knowledgeable COP observer in the room with us has informed me that he has heard that there will be a new text in 32 minutes.
So that's the update on the text. On the bid, another knowledgeable person in this room has dropped something in one of my WhatsApp feeds, which says that Turkey aren't claiming a win. And to the degree they've said anything can happen at any time in response to questions.
I feel vaguely frightened by that statement.
Clear as mud.
Indeed. All right. Anything else on the Big Four?
So I have a thought on the NDC and BTR Biennial Transparency Review. Justice for BTR. We haven't talked about it so far. On that front, which is that whatever the content of the political text that is agreed on this year, I think it's fair to say this process will not have digested fully and responded to the state of where we are on ambition and implementation towards 1.5. And like some COP soon, maybe it's COP31, we're going to have to be confronting a series of unlovely choices, which are really, really doubling down on rapid mitigation or acknowledging overshoot and the consequences of that and the grappling with like how you do the net negative emissions part of overshoot, or accepting higher warming overall and all the consequences that flow from that, or doing mad scientist stuff, spraying sulfur into the stratosphere. I think that's the universe of unlovely options. And this is not the COP to choose, but good luck to the host of COP31, whomsoever that may be.
Well, it's setting the stage for that, right? And it's interesting, and having sat in on those chats, the AOSIS grouping really led out with their desire to see language in the text that sort of stated that we are heading for overshoot. Like they wanted to see that explicitly acknowledged in the text, that there will be overshoot, that every fraction of a degree over 1.5 matters. And so far as I can tell, that hasn't made it into the cover text that we've seen. So I think I think you're right. We are heading for this, horrible kind of reconciliation with the reality of what we're faced with. And the options that have been put on the table so far really kind of ball up a process whereby we could be doing a gap analysis in the next year and having that a report delivered to the next COP, and then presumably what is the collective response of parties to that? So that it's going to be some variation of that, and that's a huge conversation for a presidency to grapple with.
Maybe to add another couple of things that are part of this big political package that we haven't talked about yet is adaptation and adaptation finance, and also what to do with the just transition kind of impetus that's come out of this process. We've had this just transition work program Do we want to collectively agree some new ways to use this process to talk about how to deliver those just transitions, what kind of planning countries could put in place, what principles there are for a just transition, those kinds of things. That's one of the big questions that's talked about outside of this Muchirao decision on the Big Four issues, but will definitely be a core part of the political deal that's struck here. On the adaptation side, we've got this conversation ongoing, kind of finalizing the framework of how you measure the collective goal that we have to adapt to climate change, to prepare our communities to deal with climate impacts. We've been talking here about the indicators that you would use to measure progress towards that global adaptation goal. It's become more contentious than I think any of us expected before coming to COP. There's a lot of disagreement about how you would agree. There were 100 indicators in the kind of last round of conversations about how you'd measure this adaptation goal. And there's a disagreement here about whether and how to finalize those indicators. But the bigger question on adaptation is on adaptation finance, where we've had for the last 5 years a goal since COP26 to double the adaptation finance that developed countries are providing to developing countries. That expires in 2025. We won't really know if we achieved it or not until the reporting on finance comes out, which has a bit of a 2-year lag. But there's a strong desire from a lot of developing countries here to reset a global direction and signal on what adaptation finance is going to be provided. That ended up coming up in that Big Four Muchirao decision package.
Yeah, despite some initial resistance from the room on, well, that's not one of the items we agreed to discuss, and I think, everyone knew that we were going to land in this place where we were talking about all the key things. But one of the options there are quite different options on the table in that last text, including one to triple adaptation finance, however you benchmark that.
And so my question about that is that proposed tripling from a range of developing countries, is that tripling the double? And is that another triple-double?
No more triple-double, Senate. It's already confusing enough.
The proposed text was to triple 2025 levels, which hopefully will have doubled from 2019 levels. But as I said, we won't know that until we get the reporting in 2 years' time.
Alex, so much of our conversations over the next few years are going to work around this fulcrum of 1.5, right? And you spent a lot of time thinking about the role that business groups and civil society can play in creating a frame within which parties act in the most impactful way possible. And so what's your view about the role that interested stakeholders, the broader ecosystem around the UNFCCC process, how should we be approaching that question of 1.5? Because there's this tension, right? We don't want to let it go because it's so critical, and yet, there is, as Tennant says, there's going to need to be some sort of reckoning with where we find ourselves, right?
Definitely. I mean, we've had the UN Secretary General come in here and talk about the fact that it's now likely that 1.5 will be overshot. But that doesn't mean we give up. That means we need to work really hard to pull back from that overshoot. As AOSIS have been saying, every fraction of a degree matters. What this process can't do is change the calculations of the emissions in the atmosphere and what that means for the global temperature trajectory. What it can do is provide global direction, share knowledge, help unlock finance and enabling conditions to put policies in place for businesses to change the way that they're doing their business so that the emissions can be reduced, basically. What we have seen here is a really strong push from business groups, from civil society groups working in huge cross-sectoral coalitions to encourage countries to come up with a plan here, some kind of roadmap to 1.5, some kind of process to keep talking about what the policies would be to actually reduce emissions at the scale and pace that would help us pull back from that overshoot to 1.5. We've just seen yesterday a huge show of support for the idea of picking up this commitment to transition away from fossil fuels and come up with a roadmap towards what that would actually look like. We've had a group of 100 businesses and subnational governments put their own letter to the presidency who asked for submissions on what this Mutual text should end up looking like. We've got business groups and subnational governments asking for this process to provide some direction on how we deliver that transition away from fossil fuels as the core lever to keep us closer to that 1.5 degree warming limit.
An extra thought is, I'm all aboard for the move from negotiation to implementation. There's a heck of a lot of implementation to be done. But if you think about the issues that are left around this, how do we respond to the state of the budget for 1.5? Every one of those options, the logistics of overshoot, the extreme increase in adaptation and loss involved in accepting a higher level of warming, geoengineering, where in a recent episode of the pod, we looked at research indicating that the most coordinated across all latitudes version of spraying crap into the stratosphere was the least costly and most likely to have more limited side effects. All of those things sound like there's a lot of negotiations yet. Like, the negotiations are not dead. They may be about to enter new and even harder ground.
All right, we're going to forge some new ground and invite questions from the floor to the Let Me Sum Up podcast. Are there any, while people think about what they might want to ask, are there any final thoughts on the Big Four or the state of the negotiations?
I have a rant, but maybe you should exercise your discretion.
I think if we're seeing new text in half an hour, we're going to find out whether the Brazilian presidency's strategy is paid off.
21 and a half minutes.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Set the clock.
Counting down.
Yeah, I'm true. Yeah, I've embraced the status of cop tragic and nerd, but maybe just to admire the diplomacy that I've seen at work here. They've really struck, I think, a different tone to what we've seen in the last couple of COPs, and I think it would be an incredible statement to the world if you could come away, even if it's not today, but a bit early, and maybe with better language around fossil fuel phase out and, some of the things that have been really contentious over the last few years. I think it bodes well, and I think I have a lot of respect from what I've seen of what the Brazilian presidency has done so far.
Definitely. I also take heart from the fact that countries are engaging constructively in these discussions about potentially agreeing a Mutual decision on these big contentious issues. We thought we were going to come into COP in a bit of a geopolitical storm where hard wars and trade wars were distracting leaders' attention away from any kind of political space to agree something on climate change, and that isn't the case. We saw leaders turn up, not as many of them as there could have been, but it's difficult to get to Belém. We saw them turn up and make a very strong show for their continued commitment to multilateral cooperation and climate action, despite anything that's coming from north of the border here.
Don't mention the war. Do we have a question from the floor for our panel? Nikki, so if you could introduce yourself for our listeners at home.
Thanks, guys. Awesome to be here. Great podcast as always. Nikki Hutley, independent economist from Australia and climate counsellor. You're talking a lot about the multilateral process, and obviously that's why we're primarily here. But everywhere in every pavilion, business is present, both in a positive and perhaps less so sense. There's obviously, the fossil of the day was Indonesia the other day because they had 40 representatives from fossil fuel industries as part of their delegation. Question, what is the role of the business sector, the non-government sector in this process from here, and how important is that, irrespective of how well Brazil does this time round?
That is a fantastic question. Tennant, Alex?
Rant triggered. That role is contested, and there are people here who are going around saying business shouldn't be here, or a bunch of businesses shouldn't be here, and are presenting, I think, a really apocalyptic view of domination of the negotiations by the fossil fuel industry. And as somebody who has, because I'm a very tedious person, gone through the, 80,000 names that were registered, maybe 100,000 that were registered for the COP28 attendee list, to go, is this a fossil fuel lobbyist? Is that a fossil fuel lobbyist? The numbers that are put out are very dramatised numbers. And in fact, there's a huge representation here of businesses that are either looking to learn or looking to show the solutions, the real solutions that they have, either that they've implemented in their own activities or that they are offering to their customers. And that's most of what is happening here on the business front and what should happen here. There are some people in the audience who, on behalf of business, track these negotiations very closely. I think they would agree that these negotiations are exceptionally difficult for anyone to actually influence, certainly once you are on the ground here. If you get the chance to speak to a negotiator and they are conscious, you are lucky. What happens between business and governments happens in home countries. And you can't change that by giving or not giving passes to people to come to COP. And this is just, again, it's the best place in the world to learn about what is happening in the fight against climate change in every economy in the world.
I also agree with the suggestion that, this is the biggest kind of climate trade show on Earth. There's sort of magic and possibility that happens when you bring sort of disparate stakeholders together. And I think part of the vision for an Australian-hosted COP in Adelaide was to attract investment to our transition, right? That's a very real proposition. We've seen that happen for other countries that have hosted COPs. So, deals get made around COPs. And that is no bad thing at all. And I think something, and I don't know if others have had the chance to wander down to the green zone, but it's so much vibrancy and amazing to see kind of Brazilian businesses, really there and engaged and talking about really innovative solutions that they've got. So, I think just that evolution of probably what we're really talking about here, which is that kind of slow enmeshing of blue and green zones over time, where you're really trying to engage the business community, is a really good thing, and we should be shooting for more of it.
Yeah, look, I feel the tension of this as well. My one claim to fame is being quoted on the front page of the FT with a sassy comment that I don't think all of these non-state actors or these businesses at COP28 are here to listen to hours of negotiations. But the reality is that we can't do it without business choices.
They're weak. They're soft.
But the reality is we can't do this without businesses and the choices that they're making. We also wouldn't be doing it without businesses and the choices that they're making. In the lead up to the Paris Agreement being signed, we really saw that surge of momentum coming from the business community calling for a global framework to address this crisis. And without that, we wouldn't have had the political space created for countries to actually come together and agree the Paris Agreement. So we need them here as well.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Nick Dawood, GM of Govern International Strategy at Arena. Frankie, your point at the beginning about First Nations, it's impossible to ignore the First Nations presence here in Amazonia. Keen to hear the panel's thoughts on how that presence has not just informed the vibe here, but also negotiations, and what lessons we might take if and when COP31 happens in Adelaide, and how that might inform our COP.
I think it has been so striking to see Indigenous people protesting, as is their right. And I think their point is around having access and, being able to speak for themselves, in this context. And so I really sort of not enjoyed the follow-on discussions around the security presence that then ensued from that. And I think, whilst I like to think that an Australian-hosted COP wouldn't see a bunch of like paramilitary troops kind of called in at the venue, I think it is. I think we should heed the warning there that we want to engage and really champion our First Nations people's perspectives if we were lucky enough to host COP. There is so much possibility for empowerment and enfranchisement of our First Nations people. So much of what needs to be done when it comes to the rollout of renewables and other things is going to happen on country, right? And there is a chance for those communities not just to have things done to them, but to be active participants on that. And I think, and this is just, well, not unsolicited advice because you asked the question, but I would love to see a really strong program of engagement and really bringing in First Nations people, not just in Australia, but also the Torres Strait and our Pacific partners, and really putting them at the heart of things.
It's kind of that moral authority, right, that grounds everything that we're doing, because it's a trade show. It's an incredibly complicated governance process. It's kind of a circus. But when you bring that Indigenous perspective into the centre, you just feel it and you feel present. And we can all benefit from that. But it is incumbent on everybody involved with whatever influence they have to create the space for that to take place, right?
On top of that, there's also so much to learn about custodianship of nature and how we can learn from Indigenous people's perspectives in addressing this crisis, that this is part of the role of the UNFCCC process to provide that space for knowledge sharing, and having a program that brings a lot of that in would really benefit a COP31 in the Australia Pacific.
And an extra angle of this is there's been, I think, a lot of excitement in Australia around the bid because of the economic opportunity dimension of a response to climate change, the huge reshaping of regional patterns of trade and investment that could be involved. That involves necessarily, certainly for Australia, but I think in other economies, Brazil's opportunities, that involves opportunities but also risks for Indigenous peoples and custodians of land. And so it's absolutely vital that people, that those peoples be in at the ground floor of those discussions, that they be proactive partners in any developments that take place, rather than having things done to them again. And so I would hope that wherever COP31 takes place, the opportunity for Indigenous peoples to have that voice, and more broadly, the opportunity for civil society to have a strong voice inside the COP and outside its doors, it really needs to come to the fore. We can't have a COP where people are afraid to speak.
Well said. I'm looking at the sound booth. Cue theme music.
The cue is coming. It's coming. Oh no, wait, there's words being said behind the booth.
We can all just hum it.
I don't know, it's not very hummable. I love our theme tune, I just don't think it's that hummable. This gap will be edited.
All right. That is our show today. A huge thanks to Trudy, Edward, Phil and the entire team here at the Australia Pavilion. And whether you want one of these stylish t-shirts or to access some sweet and spicy bonus content via our Patreon, message is clear. Run, don't walk to letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich, Tennant Reid and Alex Scott, I'm Luke Menzel. Stay strong, Australia, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, guys.
There should be more of these live. This is so fun.